A wholehearted welcome to my presentation about my project Evolution of Information Processing Systems. Today I will lay special emphasis on the influence of the advent of intelligence on evolution. First, about evolution theory. The process of evolution is not only a biological concept. This was also known to its originator Darwin as an intuition, as he intuitively wrote to his colleague G.C. Wallich in a private letter conversation. The principle of continuity renders it possible that the principle of life, that is the descent with modification idea he described in The Origin of Species, that the principle of life will hereafter be shown to be part or consequence of more general law, or of some general law. So this was at his time really a conjecture and not science, because evolutionary theory was in its beginnings, in its origins. So at his time, it was something he only shared with his colleague in a private conversation. But what about today? Do we have enough observations and deductions today? I would say a careful and tentatively uttered yes, but it is still speculative. The challenge we have is that we have enough observations, but the deductions, of course, are difficult, as deductions between different subjects like physics, chemistry, and from there back to biology are always very difficult if you are not totally knowledgeable about the history. And of course, we are not. But the evolutionary theory evolved into the modern synthesis. That is something which is a great achievement of today's times. The modern synthesis has strengthened the theory of descent with modification by adding, for example, genetics most prominently. There is a nice anecdote saying that already Mendel wrote a letter about his experiments on peas and his interesting results, the basis for genetics, to his not colleague Charles Darwin, because Darwin did not read the letter. It was unopened on his desktop. So things like that happen, and therefore science had to wait some more years for the origin and the advent of genetics, which then came with the interesting and fascinating crystallographic photograph made by Rosalind Franklin and Watson and Crick quickly interpreted this as the DNA having a helix structure and developed their theory of the genetic material being carried by nucleic acid. Of course, also the influence of Schrödinger's What's Life was very important for this development. So Watson and Crick, and especially Crick, built what is called a central dogma, which says that the flow of information goes over DNA, RNA to protein only and never in the other direction. That is the second thing that is now developed further. It has been challenged by many. And the first thing that was challenging this statement was the discovery of the reverse transcriptase mechanism in retroviruses already shortly after Crick uttered it. And then there were many more instances where we found out that protein and RNA both highly influence the DNA translation and transcription reading rate. Yeah, but what is still valid about the central dogma is that it is difficult, or until now we do not know a mechanism to get information which is stored in a protein and its special protein folding into a sequential information in DNA. But epigenetics describes the process which I was describing before. So protein and RNA change the rate with which DNA is transcribed and translated into protein, and therefore have a strong influence coming from the outside environment on the genetic organization. Jablonka is one of the important figures in epigenetics, but there are many, many today, and it's a solid science. The next thing that came to evolutionary theory in the modern synthesis is morphological computation and morphological intelligence. This was described prominently by Michael Levin and his team, and he found out about a possible electromagnetic code with which cells react to changes in their inner structure and communicate about it. And then there is EvoDevo, which is described, for example, in Vienna by the KLI and the Müller group, where we found out that in the ontogenetic process of the developing individual, there is a strong invariance, which can then be influenced by external influences, for example, from the mother, giving information about the nutritional status of the mother, giving information about the weather conditions outside in which the mother lives. So that can generate different phenotypes by manipulating the Hox genes, for example, which are very important for the EvoDevo evolutionary development process. And then there is cytoplasmic structural stores of constraints. The more we look in the inside of a living cell, which is now possible, fortunately, and we see the intricate structures and fine structures in the cytoplasm, we understand that there is a lot of information processing going on already there. Physical information processing, that is. And then niche construction is also an important topic we know of from, for example, the famous example with the beavers, which change and influence their environments by their dams. But of course, we also know it from our own species and the cultural influence of cities and big buildings on future generations. So this about the genetic theory, about the evolutionary theory, sorry. Now we come to basic principles of organization on which, if we take it seriously, that there is a more general law behind the biological interpretation of the evolutionary theory, which demands that there need to be organizational principles already before life originated. So what could this be? What is contributing to organization? Immediately comes to mind, of course, the second law of thermodynamics, that is a tendency to mutual independency and maximum distribution about as many degrees of freedom or excitable energy levels and configurations as are available. That is the principle which is immediately observable, for example, when you drop a cup and see that it splitters into many, many pieces. But thanks to the work of Lambert and others, we found out that it is not only about the increase of disorder in the environment due to entropy growth. It is actually a distribution around many degrees of freedom, which not necessarily brings disorder. That is a very important finding, which took a long time to go to the minds of scientists and science. And this tendency of mutual independency and maximum distribution comprises entropy maximization, externalization of energy, and locally, of course, the energy transformation into energy which is not any longer available for the system and which is, as it is externalized to the environment, enabling local entropy to reduce at the cost of increase of external entropy growth. Globally, energy is conserved. The second tendency would be one to synchronize in motion and to stabilize in groups of correlated non-independent units. Do we have this tendency? Oh, yes, we do. It is just not so well known. And of course, it's more difficult to observe as it needs a transformation of energy or an input of very improbable, highly improbable initial conditions to happen. So there is a lot of constraining necessary. And that led to it intuitively being connected to some kind of intelligence acting on those constraints or arranging those constraints. Nevertheless, we know very many cases of self-organizations where those constraints can build up by themselves. It is just difficult to understand the maintenance of the constraints, but therefore evolutionary theory is very strong. Evolutionary view of the development in time, that is. So this tendency to synchronize in motion and stabilize in groups of correlated non-independent units is most prominent in wave dynamics, where you have interference and mode coupling, long-range correlation, synchronization, and in classical dynamics and classical mechanics, you have the principle of stationary action, which in the view of quantum mechanics, as in QED, developed by Feynman, is also related to a wave dynamic interference mechanism, which brings together motions that are contrary in their direction and brings them together in interference and in situations where coherence plays an important role, and therefore, again, phase matching and mode coupling. But principle of stationary action is in its other form very useful in classical mechanics with the Euler-Lagrange equation to predict motion for conserved systems where no dissipation needs to be taken in account. This is a very interesting thing which will play a role later. The unequal treatment of those two organizational principles made it difficult to discuss their working together. Science, especially applied sciences and engineering, mainly for historical reasons, focused therefore on the second law as naturally given, and the principles of correlation as dependent on intelligence, as I said, and external intervention. So which definition of intelligence lay we down for this statement? If we say that intelligence means ability to use an improbable effect or action which constrains dissolution and uncertainty, then it would be a definition with which we could work. But unfortunately, intelligence is not well defined. As we find out here, intelligence is mostly connected to human ways of thinking and modeling in mind processes. If you are interested in those modeling in mind processes, which are highly derived in the evolutionary process and occur, for example, in primates, of course, humans, other primates, and many birds, crow birds and parrots, and maybe partly also in squid, interestingly. Then you could watch the BBC documentation series Inside the Animal Mind by Chris Packham, and especially the part 3 of it, The Problem Solvers. I highly recommend this series. It is very enlightening and well done. Here you get a nice introduction into the 4 main subtopics of the modeling in mind intelligence, which would be flexible thinking, mental time travel, tool use and tool construction, and thinking in form of cause and effect and abstract thinking, which then comprises also the development of language, for example. You could also use an etymological approach to understand intelligence, and Latin interlegere is literally reading in between. This is a very interesting finding, and I encourage you to ponder on it, but we will leave it like that for the moment. We need something which is strongly applicable, and that would be the third definition, which came out quite late in the scientific progress. This would be the ability of reaching a goal state which can be kybernetically defined after Rosenbluth, Wigner, and Bigelow, for example. Levin uses it a lot. And this reaching a goal state can happening on different paths under changing influences. That is a very neutral definition for intelligence with which we could explain prebiotic intelligence acting in the evolutionary process. Now about the evolutionary process and the perspective of evolution. What does the evolutionary view give us to improve our world model? First, I put here a very simple graphic showing that the idea of the evolutionary process goes assuming a starting state somewhere in the past and an observable state which is in the present. And there is a connection between start and present state, which we do not exactly know of, but we know that there is environmental selection processes acting on this development in time. And there are two a little bit complementary influences that define this process. First, the cumulative nature of the process. Each change is made in the context of prior events. That would be the hereditability aspect. And second, the adaptive challenges that cannot be planned for in advance. They avoid that or prevent that the process is getting too static and too fixed. The focus on the traits is important. The focus in evolutionary theory needs to be on the traits instead of on the organisms. Because if you focus on organisms, you run into the difficulty to think in the old idea of the scala naturae, which originated already in ancient Greek with Plato and Aristoteles, and which gave a strongly static view on how things developed, beginning by not living stones over plants and animals to humans as the crown of creation. So this is a view that very, very long time prevailed. But fortunately, today in evolutionary theory, we found that the process is much more dynamic. There is not this assumed static in it, and it is enriched by lateral information transfer that developed it into a tree structure at the time of Darwin. And later on today, we are thinking about it more as a rhizome of life structure with many, many in-between connections and gene and information transfers that went laterally. So when we draw a simple picture of how this evolutionary process of physical information processing could look like, we have something like this pyramid here. We start with organizational aspects of energy matter deep in the realm of physics, and then progress into the selective regime of conditioned reaction and structural disposition properties, and where discrete energy levels, absorption and emission play an important role. And you can describe those laws of the realm of chemical selective regime with the periodic table of elements and laws which can nicely be described, but are of course inherent in the selective system. Then you have the progression to neural and signal molecule-based networks and transfer of information in the form of genetic processing and electromagnetic signaling. That would be the biological, biochemical, metabolic, selective regime. And from there, you come to the regime we know of now very well, which would comprise oral communication, written language, technical signal transmission with the help of artifacts, and so on and so on. So with an evolutionary perspective, one is looking at evolving units inside selective regimes whose criteria of selection may themselves be subject to evolution. Now, the next important concept we need to understand better is information. Information is, like intelligence, also not very well defined. There was lately a paper I cited at the base of the page, the creativity of authors in defining the concept of information. In there, you have a mentioning of 32 different authors and 32 different theories of information. So it's difficult to find a consensus to include both aspects, the meaningfulness of information and the quantitative calculability of information. So about the meaning, we have a quite agreed upon definition made by Gregory Bateson based on McKay, which is a difference which makes a difference. And with this, we can work in physical information systems when we further ask the questions, how does a difference arise in physical structures? So what is a physical difference? And how can a difference be made in physical structures? What makes a physical difference? Information, when we are talking about it, of course, we need to mention the quantifiability of information, which is given in information of communication and of our language, of course. Communication signals, which are composed of units from a finite set, that is important, by rules which are agreed upon, known to sender and receiver. And with this setup, you have the possibility to quantify information in a binary selection process. And that was nicely done in Shannon information entropy measure, which was published in the Mathematical Theory of Communication. The formula below and the concept was a great success in telephony and signal engineering and facilitated the development of cultural intelligence. The second is physical information. Now we talked about meaningfulness of information. Quantifiability is very, very difficult in physical information. But we will go on with the idea from Bateson and the questions we were asking. So first, what is a physical difference? What makes a physical difference? I would propose to use the help of functionality and the concept of functionality for asking this question. I have made a maintenance-focused view definition of functionality and published it in the paper mentioned below to enrich the function definition about a concept or with a concept which is more neutral and not so strongly dependent on the statement functional is what does what it should do, because this should do again is something that is deeply connected to anthropocentric reasoning. So the neutral maintenance-focused view of function would state the functionality as something like this. A functional structural disposition is something which increases the probability of this disposition and its effect to be maintained in its environment. And negatively formulated, it would mean that the property does not lead to dissolution of its structural disposition and does not lead to being extinguished inside the environment. And there, of course, this rings a bell. That is a deep connection to the second law of thermodynamics, so that the second law of thermodynamics, which always directs into a state of thermodynamic equilibrium, does not lead to the dissolution of the structure. So there needs to be some constraint, some threshold of activation energy, which is very important to maintain a structure. And the second thing that is an advantage in the maintenance approach I would propose is that from this you can include easily symbiosis going from mutualism to parasitism, the whole spectrum and the whole oscillation happening inside this spectrum, because rarely is something only parasitic and only mutualistic. And we know of many instances where parasitism is very important for future developments and for jumps, so to speak, in evolution to levels which were not being possible before. So parasitism, apart from that, already does something very right in evolutionary processes, because it is something that occurs in all levels I introduced just of selective regimes in the evolutionary process of physical information development in time. So together with other less neutral function definitions, for example, the etiological and the complex systems definition, there is a well-fitted toolbox to address the above questions, I would say. Something which is important in the sense of biology, realizing that there is something coming from the outside that endangers its maintenance is, of course, sensory capacity. A difference to be found needs an observer, an instance which is not energetically coupled to the structural disposition and not part of it, so that it cannot influence the development of an observation before it is made. The sensation of difference is mainly a product of the observer, and that means it is a subjective signal generation from physical basics. Biology is evolved to exploit this. The sensitivity threshold is inside a sensor and is defined by its structure, and other things are also very strongly influenced, for example, by memorized events. Then contextual issues coming from the outside environment mainly and are dependent on context, and the interfacial signal generating structure based on structural selective systems which report subjectively relevant changes in relationships of components on different time scales are mostly on the membrane interfaces and inside the body of the sensory carrying organism or system. Interestingly, the principle of stationary action or correlative principles in general and a second law act inside, but the system which makes the decision does not need to know how they act together to be using the sensory capacity, that is. So the hypothesis regarding the interplay of physical laws and biological information processing, which I developed during the last years of my literature research for this project, were taken from many different disciplines, especially in engineering and in applied physics. And I will mention them only shortly because it would need another long presentation to delve deep into it, but we can maybe talk about it a bit more, more in detail in the discussion. I would love to. Okay, in physics, we know every material has a characteristic phonon spectrum which describes the allowed vibrational modes and their frequencies. This spectrum is determined by the material's crystal structure, atomic masses, and interatomic forces, and it is subjective. So this is the structural information which defines the selectivity of the physical information processing. Then second, significant deformations, changes in pressure, in tension, but also in the refractive index in optics, can lead to anharmonic effects where nonlinear interactions among phonons become prominent. So this is about the dynamics that utter changes. And third, when anharmonic terms, higher order terms, are introduced into the potential, they disturb the stationarity of the phase or the action for the classical path. This is language used in quantum electrodynamics, and it hints at the principle of stationary action, which only acts in, or which only is valid for conservative systems, and this is when dissipation comes in. 4. Non-stationarity of action in classical physics often corresponds to more complex potentials, typically involving higher order terms, and these terms facilitate dissipation and other non-conservative effects, which, like how anharmonic terms in quantum systems, then allow for phonon-phonon in quantum, but interactions, and thereby a higher set of quantum behaviors in quantum mechanics, facilitating behavior more wave-like than particle-like. In quantum mechanics, it would mean quantum interference and nonlinear effects, that is, increased tunneling, coupling between different modes or energy levels, localization, entanglement, and many more. So if feeling really exploits something like this as a biological mechanism for being aware of a closed entity state and changes to that state in time, this would help in functional decision-making and give an evolutionary advantage. The definition of closed entity is based on Rosen's description of closed to efficient cause systems. If newer evolutionary developments are indeed descendants of physical information processing, we might expect the following. Repeating, but thanks to long evolutionary dynamics, only analogous patterns. I put here explanation to make clear what I mean. Pictorial explanation with the 4 limbs of vertebrates. For the left corner, you have a bat forelimb, and in the right down corner, you have a bird forelimb, and you see there is a relationship between them regarding the number of digits and the bone structure. It's just a little bit deformed according to the process where it is needed, but it is homologically related and going to a relation, a genetic relationship in not a long time span viewed in evolutionary scale. For contrary to that, the fly, the insect in the right, in the down right corner, is of course not homologically related to those vertebrate flying animals, but nevertheless it has to obey, and its wing structure has to obey necessary affordances coming from physics. Just physical laws and aerodynamics make it necessary to have certain structures, although the behavior, the body structure, and the body mass is strongly different. You have analogy in how the flying trait adapts to physical necessities. We would also expect basic principles. Basic principles I would tentatively propose from my research results should comprise intricate couplings between linear superposition and nonlinear mixing. Second, a capability to scale recruitment of elements to task size, and a capability to explore existing problem spaces linearly. That is where I introduced the sensory capacity for. So there is no non-linear restructuring necessary of the whole body. It can explore the space linearly. Mechanisms of enhancement, dampening, and phase transition I would expect to play an important role as basic principles, and 2 types of storage for material structure and dynamics, comparable to hardware and software, but not quite so. We talked about only analogous and only similar. This is very important to have in mind in connection with this. And the 2 types of storage of information I would call kinetic and structural information to honor the great work of Tom Stonja and his book, Information and the Inner Structure of the Universe. About the outlook, if the hypothesis can be tested and confirmed, we might be able to use all the great work which has been done in the field of physical information processing, just to mention von Weizsäcker, Lotka, Odum, Stonja, Levin, to connect information processing in the realm described by physics and chemistry to biology and the human world of purely intention-based, highly abstracted information processing in a recurrent line, guided by the evolutionary view on its development in time, and continue maybe where Darwin and Wallich could only speculate. This, of course, is a highly interdisciplinary, intercultural work where ideas and concepts developed by today's thinkers are needed together with recorded information from earlier thinkers and need to come together. Just as an idea, when governments only announce one thing honestly, what we want and what we want to avoid, it would be a solid base, without commentary. Just a trivial example for the conclusion of where one can model the influence of intelligence as a scaling of input of physical quantity and of the physical quantity power, and where you can see how efficient direction and efficient enhancement of this input of the quantity power developed over the different selection regimes. And you could say intelligence has a strong influence on the selective process in evolution, but I present it as a trivial example just to look at. So you have the selective environment physics. In physics, you have the selective environment of biological decision-making systems, of intentional human decision-making systems, and I put the intentional decision-making environment into 2 parts. One about the individual, mostly older in the human history information processing system, and the cultural is a bit of a newer development in human intentional decision-making systems. So we look at the power input into wood, into a tree, yeah? And we look at the motivational drive to do so. In the physical selective environment, you have a goal-less drive. It's just the physical laws of chaotic dynamics where strongly disordered and strongly chaotic parts come together with more ordered parts, and this over the whole global environment creates weather phenomena. If they are very strong, they can devastate total woodlands. Then the selective environment of biological decision-making and the example of the woodworm. For the woodworm, the drive is about survival. The wood is its nutrition source. It goes into the tree and eats it. In a human individual decision-making system, the drive to harvest trees for building huts and for housing evolved. And that was then in analogy, or after the caves which humans had to live in, they built their own wooden caves. Then in intentional cultural human decision-making, another drive came in addition to housing, that is restructuring of total landscapes with trees to have agricultural land. Okay, and then you see what the possibilities of influencing the power input and the directionality of this power input into the trees developed, what influences developed. Just to add here a little bit of an emotional input, you have also another drive in the evolution in intentional human decision-making systems, which would be acting powerful in view of trees and harvesting trees like hunting animals and having this connected with a strong emotion. I did not make this up. There exists a computer program called Mega Harvester where you can act out those drives and just think about it. There are all those different drives available in the history of evolution, and thanks to the recurrent system character, you have all of those drives also, at least in principle, being available in any stage that came later. So the earlier stages are included. So if it is housing and restructuring, and then together with emotionally driven harvesting, then you can get to very strong outcomes. I'm just showing this here again a little bit more scientifically with values. You see, of course, a hurricane, an extreme event, can enter power with 10 to the 11th to 10 to the 12th kilowatt and can be devastating, not only for woods. Woodworms have an input of mandibular power of less than 0.18. I did not find a better source, but one about stag beetle mandibular power. So this is just an estimation. But if you take this this input by a single individual times thousands, of course, you also get considerable input. And we know that neighboring trees can be infested easily so that the phenomenon spreads. In a human, using an artifact like an axe or a saw, you have 440 to 500 watts, which can be directed into the wood. And you have, of course, maximum powers in humans that reach until 2,500 watts, but that is not what muscular power can enter for more than some minutes. But with artifacts like the chainsaw that is using the Carnot cycle for motor in enhancement of power input, you have 2.8 kilowatts. And a harvester, the thing that is simulated in the app I just mentioned, enters an input of 250 to 850 kilowatts. And if you take this to the thousands, then the effect becomes near to what you get with goal-less influences. Not as much, of course, but in a very and highly directed manner. So the question is, does it lead to something like this? Does intelligence create new problems which it then needs to solve? Certainly. So about the parts of the pyramids, some more neutral and more positive outlook on the project. Both parts of the pyramid needs to be developed further. My project was mostly focused on better understanding of physical information, but of course the upper part of the pyramid is as important, and as are the parts in between and the connection of the different realms. So maybe possible use of understanding of functionality and structural kinetics coupling from physics in physical information could be possible to categorize phenomena in the intention-based decision-making selective regimes of today. So the table could look like this. So you have evolution as a multi-level and recursive process with complex bodies or larger evolving structures. The selective environments of all previous evolutionary stages are nested within each other and are still partially or even fully effective. With this view, I would propose you can understand a lot of the phenomena we observe today better based on an evolutionary recursive line that is drawn from the physics environment to the today's intentional environment and decision-making processes. And I hope I could interest you for this project, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions, and thank you very much for your attention.